Welcome back. As the nation tries to come to terms with the future of policing, what everyone's trying to do is examine the relationship between the police and the public they're supposed to protect and serve. There's actually a lot of data on this, maybe more than you'd imagine. For example, when black and white men are convicted of the very same crime, black men on average receive sentences that are nearly 20% longer. Black men in Texas, for example, make up 12% of the state's population, but nearly 30% of the prisoners who die in police custody. Blacks in California, 3.5 times more likely to be pulled over in a traffic stop than white drivers are. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. When it comes to police data on police and race, the numbers may surprise you. Our next guest just published a lengthy examination in the Washington Post. Radley Balko, he reports on criminal justice, the drug war, and civil liberties for that paper, and we spoke yesterday. Obviously, so much emotion is poured into this. What I really liked about your piece was it really separated and looked at the raw data and said that this isn't imagined, this isn't theoretical, and you go through studies coast to coast here as well as even on a national level, and you break down how the math works. First, start off with a term we hear about, systemic racism, and I think people have the wrong idea what the actual definition of it is. It doesn't mean that every cop is racist, correct?
Right. The idea of systemic racism is that the individual, the motives of the individuals in the criminal justice system are almost irrelevant. It's that the system itself has been designed to produce racially disparate outcomes. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, our criminal justice system was sort of formed and honed and revised over the years in an era when we had segregation as a matter of law in much of this country. And so the idea that that system would sort of shed all of those, those characteristics that have been built into it just because we sort of stop segregating or segregation is no longer legally enforced without an effort to kind of systemically purge those aspects from the system, it's just not going to happen. So we should expect to see a lot of racially disparate outcomes because that's how the system was built.
You start with an anecdote in there with I think a retired officer when you asked about racial profiling, and the line was, "I deny it, but it works," in effect. And the numbers, and again, this wasn't just New York, you found this in roughly 97% of the time when somebody is stopped, it turns out that there's no charges ever brought here because there was no criminality found at all. That's been the general number that you found. Only in about 3% of the cases did they actually find something, a criminal that was merit stopping someone for.
Well, I think that number comes from stop and frisks in New York City, and I think it's pretty close to that, and we've seen widespread stop and frisk in other places like Chicago. And I guess my point in that is, we often hear that racial disparities can be explained by the fact that black people commit crimes at a higher rate than white people. But if 95, 97% of the people who you're stopping and searching are innocent, it doesn't really matter at what percentage the different races commit crimes. You are stopping and searching people and hassling them and subjecting them to sort of a lower bar when it comes to their constitutional rights, simply because they belong to a racial group that may commit crimes at a higher rate. That is not treating people as individuals. That's treating them under the law as a group, and that's the very sort of thing that we're supposed to be against, and that the Constitution is supposed to protect against.
Radley, a lot of my audience from New Jersey will remember the DWB line, the driving while black, and they saw in documentation they produced about the disparities. Well, what I found interesting in your study was it's not just black or white, but also whether it's light out or dark at night, and the numbers showed a correspondence, who was getting pulled over, and when someone didn't know if they were white or black, how the numbers changed.
We have since seen dozens and dozens and dozens of studies, and the ones that are really compelling, I think, are the ones that you mentioned, which is that we see that during the day, police are much more likely to pull over black motorists, and as the day gets darker, that disparity shrinks and narrows. And if I guess the thinking behind it is that as it becomes more difficult to discern the race of the person behind the wheel, Those studies are pretty compelling. The other ones I find really compelling are study after study after study all over the country has found that Black people are much more likely to be searched after they're stopped. And those same studies then also find, however, that white people, searches of white people are actually more likely to turn up contraband. So that, kind of cuts against this idea that we only see racial disparity because Black people are more likely to be criminal or committing crimes than white people. In this case, when it comes to searches of cars, we know that Black people are less likely to be criminal than white people, and yet Black people are searched at much higher rates.
How about the fact of homicides? What did you find in the studies in terms of cases, how they were prosecuted, what were open cases versus closed cases when it was a Black person killing a white person, a Black person killing a Black person, or a white person taking a life of a person of color?
Yeah, so what we find is that cases where a white person is the victim are much more likely to be solved than cases where homicides where a Black person is the victim. And this carries over not only to just the solving of the cases, but also the punishment of the cases. When we look at the death penalty, for example, the racism that we see inherent in the death penalty is not about who gets convicted and sentenced to death. It's about the race of the victim. So if you kill a white person in the United States in a death penalty state, you are, by orders of magnitude, more likely to get the death penalty than if you kill a Black person. And the interesting thing about that is the way it plays out in terms of the actual populations on death row is that because white people are much more likely to kill white people and Black people are much more likely to kill Black people, white people are actually represented on death row at a rate that's somewhat consistent with their representation in the general population. But this goes to the fact that the race of the victim, we tend to be more angry when white people get killed than Black people, and so we want sort of more vengeance and retribution in those cases.
You also found that the trend continued, forget about from felonies, even to misdemeanor. I mean, I thought some of this was surprising. If you don't have a seatbelt on, you're twice as more likely to get nailed for it, or at least to be charged for it if you're Black. If you're jaywalking, 3 times more likely if you're a person of color than if you're white. And then prostitution, 5 times more likely. Gambling, 10 times more likely. Now, some of these were single states that did the studies, but nonetheless, this is across the board, right, Radley?
It really is, and part of that is that there's a heavier police presence in Black communities. But then when you ask why is there a heavier police presence in Black communities, the answer is because there's more crime in Black communities, which then leads to more police presence, which then leads to more arrests and more Black people with criminal records. And it's a self kind of perpetuating cycle where this kind of low level policing tends to find more crimes. That means more people get criminal records. That means, it's harder to make a living when you have a criminal record. It's harder to do a lot of things. Those people are then more likely to turn to crime, to make a living or to put food on the table or, support even, less noble means, support a drug habit, whatever. But it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. And, the way we get out of that, I think, is by first recognizing that that is what it is. And that is where the problem is.
Obviously, we're seeing nationally, at least for the first time in a long time, a willingness to acknowledge that we have inequities in the system. Now, how this turns out, who the heck knows? But I'm curious, from your research, did you find people within the criminal justice system, not just on the law enforcement side? There used to be quotas and they'd have to carry them out. And I remember talking to cops at the time in New York with stop and frisk, and they admitted, even some, that this wasn't fairly being carried out, but they had to make their number, if you will, at the end of every month. Did you find on the different levels of the criminal justice system that it was a bad system that they were working under, or did they think it was working just fine?
Well, I think a lot of people who work in it don't want to feel like they're working for a broken or corrupt or racist system. And so there's a difficulty to kind of bring yourself around to accept that. I'll tell you one place where I did see it, though, was in St. Louis County several years ago. I went and reported on the municipal court systems there. These towns have to, they have to have revenue, right? And so they ask their police officers to basically extract that revenue from the residents of these towns. The police officers, the police departments in these little towns, they only exist to get people for traffic violations, for jaywalking, for these kind of petty level offenses that they can then fine them, and then that money goes to fund these towns and cities. The really kind of perverse thing about this is that the poorer the town, which unfortunately in our country generally means the blacker the town, the more reliant they were on these fines and fees, to keep the town running. This is a great example of how systemic racism exists, sort of in spite of the motivations of the people who operate within it.
And we've hopefully given enough data here as we've been having our conversation to our audience, just to show that this is everywhere. This is in blue states, red states. It's not, it's just so prevalent. But anyway, Radley, I appreciate a few minutes today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Up next, this is Pride Month, and while pride parades and other celebrations are canceled because of the virus, the LGBTQ community, thanks to the Supreme Court, they've got a lot to celebrate. What will the impact of the court ruling actually mean to the community, and where does the fight for gay rights go from here? We'll speak with former New Jersey Governor Jim McGreevey next.